Today we're going to talk about some of the more common unit types and which ones have either won or lost on the change into 9th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Now, while all of the rules changes were being unveiled in the run up to 9th edition, it was quite clear that some unit types would be significantly stronger than they were before, and some significantly weaker. Until we had the points cost changes though, it was all sort of a little bit meaningless, as of course if you massively buff something but then double its points cost, then it still might not be good. With that in mind, now we have seen all the points costs, I thought we'd take a video to take a look through the various common unit types in Warhammer 40k, and perhaps talk about which of the units tend to have either done better or worse out of the change, if you look at them across multiple factions. I'm obviously not saying that any single one unit has done amazingly just because it's in a class that's generally done well. Obviously the individual points cost change on any one unit will have a very big effect. I more just wanted to talk about some general trends as to what sort of units we might see in the game a little bit more than before. So to start off, I thought we'd talk about smaller infantry squads. Not 100% sure why I used Genestealer Cult for this picture. It might have been better to talk about Space Marines, Custodes, Sisters of Battle, something like that. In general, I think they've done very well out of the change. They have very good interaction with terrain, such as if they're in ruins, they could be +1 to their saves, and might now even be able to make use of those new defensible rules against charges. In general, quite a lot of heavy weapons have got cheaper when on infantry platforms, such as with Space Marine Devastators for example. The morale changes generally mean that infantry aren't quite as susceptible to being wiped if you take out a fair number of them. And in general, I think we're still going to want small infantry squads for mission purposes like objectives secured or doing actions such as raising banners on objectives. For downsides, coherency can be an issue for larger squads that are over 6 in size, and I think that Overwatch going away is generally going to hurt these guys, as you're very rarely going to want to pay the 1 command point for a few scattered lasgun shots or something. In general though, small squads of elite infantry are going to be doing pretty well in 9th. The same certainly can't be said for hordes, I'm afraid. It's not all bad, but it mostly is. Morale changes where relevant are certainly helpful on big horde units. Again, you're pretty much guaranteed not to have the rest of the unit wiped out to morale, but it's not all that big a buff as quite a lot of big horde units tended to have morale mitigation shenanigans anyway. The missions, I think, will be a positive thing for them. I think they do really reward pushing up with hard-hitting units, and that's something that hordes can do. And I think that having less Overwatch about is generally going to be better for horde units, but maybe not quite as big a thing for smaller elite assault units, as they could generally afford to take a few casualties and still hit very hard in the fight phase. On the other hand though, the coherency changes really hit them hard. You can nowhere near spread out anywhere near as much as you used to be able to, and if you do make a mistake then it could be really punishing and take out a lot of the rest of the unit. Blast weapons became incredibly efficient against any unit that's 11 or more models in size, and D6 damage weapons will rinse these guys pretty quickly. Fighting in multiple ranks is heavily nerfed. With the previous changes you could fight up to 4 ranks deep in certain units, now you can only manage up to 2 ranks, due to only units being able to fight within half an inch of models in combat. Multi-charges aren't quite as easy to do as before. I think there'll be a lot more just declaring on one target and consolidating into the rest, rather than declaring on all of them, with the potential to do a bit more mass damage. On top of all this, points changes generally haven't been all that favourable to Horde Infantry, most Hordes still going up at least 1 point, which usually amounts to a pretty big percentage change when you didn't have that much of a points cost to begin with. They're also a bit more cumbersome to use the new terrain rules. Often you need the entire unit within the terrain's base, or every unit hidden behind it, and it's just not as easy to do that with a Horde. Overall, I think that between all this, Horde units just aren't going to be as common in 9th. For non-horde dedicated melee units though, I think that things are in general looking a bit more positive. Again, I think that missions are really quite key to this. There's only 5 turns to score objectives, so if you're pushing forward with dedicated melee units, then your opponent's either going to have to just fall back off objectives and miss out on vital turns of scoring, or stay there and risk a charge. It's also easier to engage units on first floor ruins, with things like Thunderwolf Cavalry for example. The generally buffed and more powerful terrain rules are going to make life harder for shooting. There's going to be more extra -1 to hits going around from dense cover, and things might be even out of line of sight thanks to line of sight blocking obscuring terrain. Having almost no Overwatch to contend with is really good unless you're fighting Tau, and that will certainly stop you suffering casualties anywhere near as much at the vital moment before you get to do your damage. As a bit of a counterbalance, I think that the biggest nerf to melee units is the multi-charge problem. The one where you can't just declare multiple things and then fight all of them through your pile-ins and consolidations. In general, you are just going to be deleting 1 or 2 units per turn, not loads of them. Vehicles being able to shoot in melee certainly isn't a great thing if you are locking them up, and a Desperate Breakout can be a fairly expensive counter to an absolutely fatal tri-pointing move, which I think on occasion will make life hard for melee units trying that strategy. Overall though, on balance, I think that melee is very slightly buffed in 9th, not massively stronger than before, and there are downsides, particularly your more stereotypical melee horde units. In terms of vehicles, and I'd also include monsters in here, generally any ranged weapons that these guys had have got a big buff. Either they're going to be able to shoot in close combat now, or they'll have gained an advantage versus infantry by acquiring the blast special rule. Secondly, moving and firing with no heavy weapon penalty is excellent both on vehicles and monsters. Being able to optimally position, whether it's better line of sight, running away from enemy threats, or just pushing up the board whilst offering no penalties to shooting, is no minor buff. For both vehicles and monsters as well, dense cover is really quite easy to acquire if you can just keep part of your hull or base hidden behind it. On the downside though, quite a few of the units did go up in cost alongside these new increased abilities. And also, unless you have any sort of special rule, then light cover isn't something that you can usually acquire if you're a vehicle or monster. It wasn't amazingly easy to get in 8th, but you're not going to be getting that +1 to saves just by terrain on the board most of the time. Overall though, I think the vehicles and monsters have received a decent buff, and as a class I wouldn't be surprised if we see a fair few more of them going into 9th. I think that flyers deserve their own special mention, seeing as they function quite differently. Again, in particular, not having to suffer the move and heavy weapon penalty is really quite a big buff to these guys. The vast majority of flyers either have to move each turn or really want to because they have amazing movement, and now they're not going to be hitting on -1 to hit unless they had a special rule to mitigate that, means that they'll now be far more dangerous than before. In addition, they also lost one of their major weaknesses in that they could be destroyed by forcing them to fly off the board in certain scenarios. Now they can go off for a turn and come back on later, means that's not such a major issue. Despite this though, I think they have had a few nerfs as well. They'll now have even less impact on missions and objectives, with lots of the secondary objectives specifically excluding flyers. They're harder to include in detachments than they once were, with the loss of the flyer wing. Negative to hit roll modifiers are capped at -1, so you can't have LA-TOC flyers running around at -2 or -3 anymore. And line of sight blocking terrain is a small nerf to them, seeing as there will be cases where they can be shot by an enemy unit over an obscuring ruin, but won't be able to shoot that same unit. It's not too bad though, as with their decent movement they should be able to get around the sides most of the time. Finally, playing on slightly smaller board sizes might mean that they have a little bit of a harder time manoeuvring, particularly with their fixed movement arcs. In general, I don't think flyers are much changed from before. These multiple small nerfs are kind of outweighed by the heavy weapon penalty going away. Though again, same with vehicles, a lot of them did just go up in points cost in a sort of direct reflection of their increased hitting power with the heavy weapon change. Overall, I think they came out pretty much even to where they were in 8th edition. Next up, if we look at Titanic units, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. First of all, knights and things can fight in upper floor ruins now, which could make life a lot easier for clearing out some entrenched infantry that could usually just laugh at them before. In general, Titanic units did tend to go up less in points than the average points cost rise, armies like Imperial Knights in particular not suffering quite as much with the rises compared with some of the others. Finally, Knights themselves, both Imperial and Chaos, got a couple of buffs. Their FAQ now allows them to move over units in the movement phase as if they weren't there, which was something that they weirdly couldn't do beforehand, and they also get to refund their command points on their main detachment in the same way that you might be able to with a battalion or a brigade. It certainly makes pure Knights or a mainly Knights army a lot more attractive. In terms of downsides though, for allied knights, or just including one super heavy in any one army, there's now a very depressing command point cost to taking them in. They really have to be really quite points efficient to be able to outweigh the 3 command points that you need to spend on them to get them in a super heavy auxiliary. And even when you've done so, they won't get anything like a household trait or a regiment trait or anything like that. They interact with terrain very poorly indeed. They won't be getting dense cover or obscuring terrain, so unless they're physically blocked out of line of sight, you'll generally still be able to shoot them. Finally, Overwatch going to cost command points is probably a nerf to these guys too. Knights and Baneblades and things could often have really meaningful Overwatch, so any restriction on that is not a good thing. Overall, I'd say that Knights and Chaos Knights are fairly even or perhaps slight losers, with the other super heavies probably being pretty major losers out of these changes. For me, the biggest single thing is the command point cost. I'd say that characters and heroes have in general taken a few minor nerfs, but it's sort of counterbalanced a bit by them only having risen in points very slightly. The main issues with them is that they're slightly harder to include in detachments, HQ slots are far more limited now there's not a supreme command option, and in general people want to field smaller detachments, which would mean less HQ slots available. Character targeting has also gotten significantly easier, now you need to have them remain within a large infantry squad or next to a vehicle or monster, or the enemy is just going to be able to shoot them dead straight across the table. Finally, heroic intervention is now a lot worse. Before, if the opponent hadn't declared them as a target of a charge, they wouldn't be able to strike at them. Now, if you heroic intervene into an enemy unit that's charged, they are allowed to make close combat attacks against them, which means that your character that's stepping up to the fight could get hit dead before he even gets to fight. It certainly makes it a bit more risky, and you're going to have to make sure that your character can survive whatever attacks the enemy unit has. Overall, I would say that they're very slightly nerfed into the new edition, but nothing enormously serious, and their synergies will still be vital for list building. Finally, I just thought I'd run quickly through a few other things. Fly units losing the ability to fall back and shoot is quite a nerf to anything with the fly keyword, though occasionally they did also drop in points costs as well, such as Space Marine Inceptors, who have gone down in points to make up for this loss of flexibility. Artillery generally gained quite a large amount. They're now able to move and fire if they're vehicles without any loss of accuracy, even if that movement is usually only a very small amount. Most of them gain the blast special rule to make them extra good against hordes and infantry, and with obscuring terrain now a thing, line of sight ignoring weaponry is going to be more important than ever. In general though, they did go up in points costs, particularly things like Space Marine Whirlwinds or Thunderfire cannons, and some of the guard artillery went up quite significantly as well, though not all of it. In general, artillery is a lot stronger, but it might be charged more as a result. In general, it's a bit of a win for bikes, I think. They can move and shoot with heavy weapons fairly easily, and they can also fight in ruins a bit better, and you can't avoid combat with them just by standing on the first floor. Transports have had their disembark range very slightly reduced, so that all models disembarking need to get out wholly within 3 inches, but if they do get completely surrounded, you might be able to get out troops a bit easier with emergency disembarkation. In general, they didn't do too badly though, almost all being vehicles. Finally, I think that Psychers got a slight nerf in this, as they can no longer fall back and still cast powers, and the changes to the command reroll make it a little bit less useful for the psychic phase, as before we could just do a very targeted reroll just by rerolling the lowest dice that you cast on the psychic test. So overall, going into 9th edition, I think that the biggest winners are small infantry squads and vehicles, and dedicated melee units aren't doing so badly either. In general, I'd say that the biggest losers are Horde Infantry, with characters, super heavies that aren't knights, and gun platforms with the fly keyword also being hit fairly hard. Please let me know your thoughts on what sort of units you think will be run in 9th edition down in the comments below, or if there's anything else that you can think of to add to the content of this video. If you've enjoyed, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll keep regular 40k content coming out every day. And if you have been enjoying the channel recently, I'd just like to mention that I do have an Element Games affiliate link, which is down in the video description below. If you'd like to help support the channel, then Element Games is a discount retailer in the UK, usually doing about 10 to 20% off Warhammer 40k models. If you were thinking about ordering in any model soldiers in the near future, if you click on Element's link before making an order, then a small amount of the money goes to help support the channel without costing you any more at all. It can just be a way to help support if you were thinking about buying something anyway. For anyone over in the USA and Canada, I do also have an Amazon link as well. Again, if you click that link before buying anything on Amazon whatsoever, then a small amount goes to help support the channel, and again doesn't cost you any more at time of sale. So if you are thinking about buying something, and you'd like to help keep Auspex Tactics going, then consider giving it a click first. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.